There may soon be a job opening on the country's highest court. Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer is expected to announce his retirement after serving more than 2 decades on the court. The vacancy would pave the way for President Joe Biden to make his first Supreme Court pick. And on the campaign trail, he pledged to nominate a black woman to the high court, a historic first. Joining us are former clerks of his, Robert Hochman, head of the Supreme Court and appellate practice at Sidley Austin, Carolyn Shapiro, a professor at Chicago-Kent College of Law and the co-director of the school's Institute on the Supreme Court, and Linda Coberly, head of the appellate and critical motions practice at Winston and Strawn. Thanks to the three of you for joining us. Carolyn, let's start with you, please. President Clinton nominated Justice Breyer he was seated in 1994. Do you see his retirement as the end of an era?
Well, certainly in some regards. The other two people on the court who are on the left with him were, of course, Obama appointees. So in that sense, it's the end of an era. On the other hand, I think Justice Breyer would see it more as passing the baton. I think he believes that he's part of a long tradition of a certain type of jurisprudence and expects that to continue, even although it may not be in the majority.
Linda, talk about how this could be, sort of a personally complicated decision for him.
Well, Justice Breyer is really an institutionalist. He cares deeply about the institution of the court and the role that it plays, and he cares a lot about the independence of the judiciary. So I'm sure it was difficult for him last summer to hear the calls for his retirement from so many people on the left. And it wasn't a surprise to me that he resisted those calls to retire on a schedule that someone else determined. I think he loves what he does. I think he loves this job. I think he plays a really important role, and I think he's got more to say. And so I'm sure for him, it is difficult to see that part of his career draw to a close. I don't think we're going to hear the last of him. First of all, his retirement, as far as I know, is not imminent. There's every reason to think he will sit for the rest of this term. But even after he steps down, I think we're going to have more to hear from him, both as an author, as a teacher, maybe as a federal appellate court judge, as some judges do. Justices do after they retire from the court. They continue to hear cases. So I'm sure that this is bittersweet for him. And I'm sure that this process has been complicated for him as he looks at what's happening on the court and also listens to what's happening in terms of the public conversation.
Right, and hopefully we'll get into some of his decisions over time. Rob, what was it like being a clerk for him?
Oh, well, that is, you're in my personal case, you're a young lawyer just starting out in your career. And Justice Breyer gave me the privilege to walk into the Supreme Court building and be part of really the pinnacle of the institution of the profession that I was entering, and right at the start. And most remarkably for me, he insisted that I not shade my views, do the work, and I don't try to predict what he thinks. He wants to know what I think. He immediately respected our judgment. He wanted it, and he wanted to get the best answer he possibly could in light of his own judgment and ours. And if that doesn't help a young person stand up a little straighter, to be honest with you, I don't know what would. So I'm forever grateful to him on a personal level for that.
Carolyn, one of his well-known recent decisions was in 2016 when he wrote the court's abortion decision striking down a Texas law that had closed nearly half of the clinics in the state. Talk about his work in that decision and what it meant.
Well, that decision was very important because he rejected a pretextual effort by the state of Texas to basically make it close to impossible for abortion clinics to operate, but to do so by claiming that they were trying to protect women's health by imposing what they claimed were necessary health regulations on these clinics. And he absolutely rejected that argument, in part by insisting as a matter of law that regulations actually had to be for the benefit of women. You had to show that they, in fact, were helpful to protecting women's health, but also by insisting on delving deep into the record. he spent an enormous amount of time looking at the facts in that case. And he liked facts. He liked to know what was happening in the world. And he spent much of that opinion detailing with great care what was happening in Texas as a result of these laws and what would happen, and what the lawyers in that case had representing the abortion providers and the women, what they had been able to establish, and that the state of Texas really had nothing on the other side.
Linda, you also have memories around his time with the State of the Union and how he viewed the importance of attending those. Tell us about that.
Well, so when we were clerking, and Rob and I clerked at the same time, it was actually during the impeachment of President Clinton. And during that time in Washington, it was a divisive time in Washington, and there was a lot of acrimony. And I remember hearing him speak during that time about the role of the State of the Union and about the importance of justices attending. You may have seen when the State of the Union is televised, it's always a lot of drama when the members of the Supreme Court walk down and are welcomed into the Senate chamber and sit in the front. And Justice Breyer felt it was really important that the court do that, and did so even when he was literally the only justice to attend the State of the Union. And that was, I think, important and a sign of how much he cares about the institutions of government, not just the court, but the legislature and the executive. And the State of the Union is a kind of ceremonial moment when those different institutions come together to form the larger institution. So it was very consistent with his ideology that he would
really
see that as an important moment.
Absolutely. Rob, did his values, contrast then, his values that he has, contrast with, the highly partisan political lens through which a lot of people view the court today?
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the truly distinguishing features of him. It's very easy for us now to fall into a trap of cynicism about the political motivations of the justices and how they drive outcomes in legal cases. And Justice Breyer has been steadfast, extraordinarily steadfast, in refusing to endorse that view. Some people think it might be stubborn. Some people on the other side might call it naive. Whatever you call it, I think you have to acknowledge it's honestly felt. He really believes that. And as Linda has been saying, he believes that because a strong independent judiciary is a jewel of liberty and a jewel of our government. And it's something that if he's not willing to speak up for, if justices sitting on the Supreme Court aren't willing to speak up for in the face of public cynicism, then who will? And I can't credit him enough for that. And I certainly hope that his retirement from the court doesn't lead to either him or others speaking less in that direction. I hope that we get more of that because we need it.
And Carolyn, what do we know about, potential nominees to replace him? And of course, there's some politics to the timing of when that nominee could be confirmed.
Well, we know that there are a number of names that have been thrown around. Two of the leading potential candidates are Justice Leandra Kruger, who's on the California Supreme Court, and Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, who is actually herself a former Breyer clerk, and who was recently elevated from the district court for the District of Columbia to the DC Circuit, which is some people think of as sort of the second highest court in the land. And they both have really remarkable reputations. The process is going to play out, I think, as quickly as Senator Schumer, Senator Durbin, and the White House can make it happen. I mean, Senator Schumer has already said publicly that he sees no reason that the Democrats can't make this happen as quickly as the Republicans confirmed Justice Barrett. And I think one reason that he wants to do that is because he doesn't want to have anything go wrong. And so the more quickly that this process happens, the less likely it is that there'll be some surprise. I don't anticipate there will be any problem. I mean, the nominees who are being talked about are highly qualified.
And of course, Democrats believe it's important to get it done before the midterm elections in case something should happen to that very slim Democratic majority in the Senate. Carolyn Shapiro, Robert Hochman, and Linda Coberly, thanks to the three of you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.